My family's most important Thanksgiving tradition is our annual jigsaw puzzle. It was only as an adult that I realized that this was a trick on my mother's part to get us to clear off the dining room table so that we could spread out the puzzle and all work on it. Well, nowadays, I still get this craving every November to do a jigsaw puzzle, but the puzzle that I spend most of my time on is a different type. It's genealogical. And unfortunately, genealogy doesn't come in a box with a picture on the cover telling you what you're looking for. And, it's a much more complicated sort of puzzle, particularly if you have a family like mine who came from various places that didn't have such great records and who have names that may not be pronounceable in any language known to mankind. Now, if you decide to go in for genealogy, I recommend choosing your ancestors carefully. In particular, you want to avoid having ancestors with common names. I have a rather legendary cousin, well, my grandfather's cousin, who was always referred to within the family as Sam Katz, the dwarf communist printer. Now, the part of the story I've heard is that the communist newspaper were the only people who would hire a dwarf, and that's why he wasn't really a communist, but that's who he went to work for. However, do you know how many people in New York in 1930 were named Samuel Katz? There are at least 735 of them, and at least 730 of those came from somewhere in Poland and were born between 1908 and 1912. It's impossible. Whenever I've complained about the Katzes to my uncle, he says, yeah, there's just so many. There's Siamese and Persian and Calico. And I find myself wishing that instead of Sam and Rose, the Katzes had named their children Siamese and Persian and Calico. Which is part of why I really like my grandfather's direct line. Their name was Chlebyatsky. Can be reasonably sure that anybody whose surname is Chlebyatsky, and particularly if they're from Tiktin, Poland, is a relative. And my very favorite of all of those relatives, because her name is unique, is my grandfather's sister, Mariasha. So Mariasha Chlebyatsky, easy to find in all sorts of records. And even better, Mariasha had another characteristic that I highly recommend for ancestors, namely a criminal record. Now, her first brush with the law actually happened when she first came to the United States, and as a 16-year-old girl traveling alone, she was held for inquiry as likely to become a public charge, meaning they thought she might become a prostitute. Fortunately, her older brother, Nathan, did remember that she was supposed to be arriving on a ship and showed up only 2 days later to bail her out and pay for her board and meals during, room and board during the time she had been held. Things got a bit better for her for a while. She married a guy named Morris Lehrman, and she Americanized her name to Mary. Not so great for the genealogists, because there are other Mary Lehrmans around, but it was a lot easier for people to pronounce. And things were going really well until Morris just up and died on her after they had 2 children, and Mary was only 33 when Morris died, leaving her with $3,000 and 2 daughters to raise. Well, she opened a beauty parlor, which seems like it should be a respectable enough business. And no, it was not a front for prostitution. Instead, the state of New York decided to investigate her for practicing medicine without a license. And they sent 2 investigators there complaining of a condition called trichosis. excessive facial hair. See, Mary had learned about this new technique that was becoming popular called electrolysis. And the investigators were actually looking at the electrolysis school and decided to use her beauty parlor, which, by the way, Mary being too prosaic, she'd named after her sister Adele and called it Adele's Beauty Parlor. They decided that Adele's Beauty Parlor would be a great test case for their theory that electrolysis was practicing medicine without a license. Mary carefully removed hair from the lip of one of the investigators, who came back a couple of weeks more, got more hair removed, and then presented, instead of the money for paying her bill, presented her with a subpoena. Well, she was found guilty, sentenced to 6 months suspended sentence, but she fought it tooth and nail. All the way from 1935 to 1937, all that was left of Morris's money went to paying for lawyers. Finally, in 1937, the New York State Supreme Court vindicated her and said, no, she really was just practicing a beautician's trade. Well, you'd think that that would have been enough trauma for one person in their life, but then her oldest daughter, Sima, got married. And Sima married a man named Jack Slansky, who moved them to far, far away from the Bronx, all the way to Hyattsville, Maryland. Well, what was she going to do? She was a good mother. She went to visit. And she had actually rebuilt her business. She'd saved up some money, and so she could afford to take the good train, and one of the faster trains. Well, in 1943, the fastest train there was a train called the Congressional Limited. It was nonstop all the way from Washington, D.C. to New York. And because this was wartime, there were always lots of soldiers on the train. And one time when she went to visit, it was September and it was Labor Day weekend. Well, there were lots and lots of travelers on Labor Day weekend, so many that they had to add on extra cars. Well, Mary found a prime seat in car number 7. That car was unfortunately the one where the junction box overheated just outside of Philadelphia. Car 7 and car 8 left the track, and all of the people in those 2 cars were killed. 79 people, the 4th deadliest rail accident in United States history. There were lots and lots of stories of the people who had been on the train. There was a Marine who never left his briefcase from his side, and after the crash, a bunch of Army soldiers came and walked off with his body and his briefcase and the sheaf of papers within there, and nobody knew exactly what was in those papers. There was a family of 3, a mother and 2 children, who were killed, and after the father had identified their bodies in the morgue in Philadelphia, he went home, shut all the windows in his apartment, and turned on the gas. I don't know if Mary's daughters went to identify her, but I do know that on her grave it says, died in an accident. And when I think about Maryasha Chlebyatska, later Mary Lehrman, I think, it's really ironic. Her life had been something of a train wreck, and then she died in a train wreck. But I will say that does make her a lot easier to research. Though I still have hope that someday I'm going to find what became of Samuel Katz, the dwarf communist printer. Thank you.